So let's go into our message. Dun-dun-dun-dun. This is the last Sunday of this series. We've been doing this for 16 weeks. It's like a whole semester. So this is the title for today. It's the big picture of emotionally healthy spirituality. So now what? Now what am I supposed to do? So we've gone through all the details over the last 16 weeks, which is like a whole semester. It's like really long. But now I want to know, what's the big picture? What's the point for me? Like, what am I supposed to take away from this? So my hope and prayer is this, is that first you realize that once we become a Christian, it's not a one and done deal, okay? Like, when you choose to give your life to Jesus, you're like, okay, now I'm old enough. I'm not just following Jesus because my parents go to church or my parents tell me to go to church, but because I actually want to go to church and I actually want to have a relationship with God and I actually want to know him. So once you make that decision, it's not a one and done deal. That's just the beginning. Like your birthday, when you're born, that's just the beginning of your life. From here on out, you have to grow in God, just like you grow physically and like biologically, right? And so one of the most important ways that we can grow as a Christian is to grow in our emotional health and in our spiritual health. And those two things are very closely connected. Growing looks like knowing how to grow in those two areas. And so let's journey back and look at some of the nuggets of truth that we've received over the last 16 weeks. And I want you to take away today, what is the most important thing for you? What's the most important reminder that you need to have? What's the most important thing that you want to put your life into? So first of all, for there to be emotionally healthy spirituality, there has to be the opposite. And what's the opposite? Emotionally unhealthy spirituality is the opposite. And so I want to remind you guys of this quote from the book. So it goes like this. Can we put the picture back up there of the iceberg? So this is the quote on the live stream also. The iceberg with the quote of the next one. Is there a next one? Can I have the next slide? Sorry. We're having a few glitches here because technology is not always fun. But here's the quote, okay? So it goes like this. It's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. So the idea is that when we grow in God and we are strong in God, then we're going to grow both spiritually and emotionally. If we're not strong in one of those areas, it's going to impact the other. And so you've seen this iceberg image a lot throughout this series. And it's that idea, is what's on the surface is just 10%. Like what I see on Sunday from you, like, oh, look at Ayong, like so sweet and so, okay, I'm just kidding. She really is sweet and kind. But what I see physically is only 10%, right? Like of who you really, really are. Like, that's why, like, you know what I mean? Like, we only see a part of each other just by seeing each other, like, on the outside. But the deeper part of who we are, that's the stuff that God wants to change. That's the stuff when he's like, great, you love me, you want to live for me? Awesome. You're my child. Let's do this. This is the work of becoming a Christian, is reworking those deeper, under the surface parts of us to be more like Jesus. And so the prime example of this is King Saul versus King David, the first and second kings of Israel. And they were two very important figures because King Saul, they literally picked him because he was good looking. That's literally why. Like, if you look in the Bible, it talks about how King Saul stood a whole head above everybody else. You know what I mean? So, like, if there's a bunch of men in the room, his head is, like, above everyone else's head. That's how tall and strong and handsome. He looked like a leader. Like, that's the kind of guy we all want to, like, make our king, and, like, we're going to follow him. But here was the problem, is that King Saul, who's supposed to be the king, the first king that leads the nation to know God more, because this is God's nation, right? He was filled with lots of fear, lots of jealousy, and he only obeyed God to a certain extent until his fear and jealousy took over, and he just did what he had to do. So on the outside, the 10% of Saul looks really amazing, but the deeper 90% of Saul was not ready to actually lead God's people. And so King Saul was no longer could be king, and so King David was put in place. Such a very, very different, like such different people. Which leads me to my second point. King David shows the second point, is that the only way that we can actually start to grow spiritually and emotionally is by knowing ourselves and knowing God, like the mirror image that I have. Like, know yourself to know God. Those two things are very well connected. You can't be like, oh, I'm super deep with God. You know those people who have like kind of like very little nunchi? You know what I'm talking about? Like, they're just not very aware of how their surroundings are impacted by like them and what they say and what they do. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? People that like, you go into a room, you're like, oh my God, that's so embarrassing. Like, why are they doing that? Why are they saying that? But they just like are not aware of the kind of impact they have. The idea is the more aware you are of yourself, the more aware you are of God, and the more aware you are of God, the more aware you are of yourself. Those things tie together. So for King David, before he was a famous king, he was a punk kid with a bunch of older brothers who were all stronger and better and cooler than him. And he was just like, like the tag-along younger brother, like super annoying. Like, oh, some of you guys are the younger brother. I'm just kidding. But like he was younger by a lot because he had 7 older brothers. So think about the oldest brother and the youngest brother. And this kid's just like a total punk, like just like a rascal, just like getting in his way. And they had their own image of David. They're like, oh, David, like he's just stupid, Like when Samuel came to anoint the king, because God was like, it's that house. It's one of those boys. And like the first son comes up and God's like, nope, not him. Second son, third son. Get all the way to the end. They're like, do you not have any more sons? Because God said none of them are here. And they're like, oh, yeah, we do have another brother. He's like somewhere. Like they literally like don't even think about him. They don't count him as one of their family members. Like how sad is that, right? But that's the family he comes from. And he's going to be the next king? When King Saul was like this motion, like super handsome, like it's such a stark difference. And right then, like God speaks to Samuel, he's like, Samuel, I don't look at the outward appearance. I don't look at the 10% of a person. I look at the 90% of a person, deep inside that only I know. And this young boy, because at that time he was young, this young boy will become a man after my own heart. King David is the only man in all of the Bible who has that title. He was a man after God's own heart. He also had great failures. He murdered one of his own loyal soldiers to steal his wife, got her pregnant, and like that baby died. Like lots of drama, okay? He did lots of bad things too. And yet God still calls him a man after my own heart. Because unlike so many others, when David failed, he came back to God and repented. This was a man who became a man after God's own heart, but he started out in a family where like they just thought he was like a punk kid. If David just listened to what his family told him he was, if he just stayed that punk kid that nobody cared about, if he really believed that's all he could be in life, could he become the king God called him to be? No. In the same way, all of us, we carry our own sets of baggage, right? Sometimes you don't know that it's baggage, but we all come from families that tell you things. For better or for worse, they usually mean well, usually. They usually want to help you. They usually want to love you. And yet, when parents say things and you're like, dude, that's like so wrong. Why'd you say that? Or like grandparents who say things that like drive you crazy. Like we all come from families that tell us certain things. Maybe it's a little bit true, but that's not who God's called you to be. Do you get what I'm saying? But the older you get, the more you have to realize those things I've heard all my life, like I'm the stupid kid, my brother's a smart kid, or like whatever it may be. We all hear those kinds of things. Like, oh, I'm the lazy kid, or I'm this kid, or I'm that kid, or I'm the one that's gonna like just, like whatever you hear, is that really true? Because we have to learn how to let those things go, because that's not who God's called us to be. Which leads me to my next point. To go forward, we have to go back. In order for you to fully be free and move forward and grow in who God's called you to be, sometimes you have to go back and look at those patterns and see how to move forward. In 2 Corinthians 5:17, it says this. It's a very famous verse, but it says this. This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone. A new life has begun. It's very famous. This idea that when you give your life to Jesus, all of the old things about you, all the things that were so broken and so hurt and so hard, it's gone. He's like, my blood over you, done. Like all your list of things that you've done wrong, gone, wiped clean. You are a new creation, and that's amazing. That's the truth of the gospel. And yet it's both. It's both instant, like Jesus is like, I died for this, so this is done. And becoming a new creation is a process. It takes time. It's both. There's an instant, like God cleans us, makes us new. We are a new person. And now he calls us to walk it forward. Wouldn't it be great if we gave our lives to Jesus and then shook, you went to heaven, everything was perfect, no hardship, everything's great. But that's not how it works. He's like, I made you new, and now you're going to learn how to live new as a new creation. And that learning how to live new, sometimes you have to go back to go forward. You have to process all the baggage we carry, because all of us have it. And I don't mean this like it's done in one day. This might take many, many years of your life. But especially at the age that most of us in this room are at, 20s, teens, 20s, 30s, this is the most important time frame to do this work. Do you know why? Because if you don't do this work, you know those like crotchety old, like, how about you the harmony there, who like are bitter at life and they've made a mess of their families. It's often because of that. They haven't processed through their past. And so they replicate it in their present with their new families. It's really heartbreaking. And so at this point, when you are young and you have the benefit of not having made as many mistakes, this is the time when you look back. You're like, God, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be like XYZ person or XYZ in my life. Like, I want to be a new creation. And so this leads me to my next point we talked about. The journey to grow in our faith sometimes requires that we learn how to go through the wall. Okay, do you remember the wall? Let me show you this image, the stages of faith right here. Here we go. So when we first come to know God, everything's great. It's beautiful. And then we like grow in God. We want to learn. We want to do all these things. We want to serve. Most people stay within those first 3 stages, kind of cycle through all their lives. And yet all of us will hit that wall, the red line, the wall. The wall that tests everything you believe. So some kind of crisis, like an external crisis, maybe it's a death in the family, or a health diagnosis, a cancer diagnosis, or financial hardship, you lose your job, or whatever it may be, some kind of outside hardship you cannot control that totally impacts your life. Or maybe it's an internal crisis where like you feel totally lost, like you feel so dry, you can't hear God's voice, like everything feels like dead inside. That's an internal crisis. Both of those things will happen in your life eventually because we're human. If you live long enough, you're going to face both. And that really tests everything in you. That wall is sometimes also called the dark night of the soul, okay? The dark night of the soul. It's so meaningful, it's true. But sometimes it feels like you're just in a season where everything is dark and you just don't know where God is. But here's the thing. If you're facing a dark night of the soul, if you're facing a crisis moment, see, here's the thing. It's not a matter of if. It's a matter of when. When will this happen in your life? At some point, some of you guys have lived very cushy lives. Everything's been kind of okay. Nothing really crazy has happened. Here's the thing. At some point in your life, there will be a crisis. There will be a wall. There will be a dark night that tests your faith. That tests everything you believe. And in that moment, what do? I'm preemptively preparing you for when those seasons come because they will. If they haven't already, they probably already have for some of you. But they will come again. And when they do, what will you do? My greatest prayer is that you will be like, wait, this is a dark night right now. This is my wall. And Stacy said many, many years ago that when I face this situation, this is my opportunity to grow in my faith. This is my opportunity that my faith can get deeper, even though it totally doesn't make any sense. Like, how can this crazy, super awful thing help me grow? But I remember that she said in the Bible, that's how God grows Christians. And that's what's happening in my life right now. One example I have, one of my darkest nights of the soul seasons was when I first had my son, Josiah. So he was born very early. Most of you guys know he was 2 pounds. He was just over 1 kilo. So you nursing students who know what that means, he was very small. He was always hooked up to all these things. And the doctors would always tell me, I don't know why. I'm like in this NICU room, like seeing my little child, my firstborn child, like literally hanging on to his life. And they're like, just so you know, he might not walk. And I'm like, thanks. Okay, great. And they're like, just so you know, like he might not be able to do this or that. And I'm just like, it was one of the hardest seasons of my life. And I have never in my life, like, been face down on the ground, in my room, like at middle of the night, like my son's in the hospital, like I'm just trying to sleep. I've never been face down to the ground crying and like the carpet is like wet, and just I have no words to say. Like, God, what are you going to do? How are you going to turn this around? Like, I have never prayed so fervently with no words in my life. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, that's when you know you're in a dark night, my friend. When you don't even know what to pray, but everything in you is like groaning and aching. But here's the thing. It's weird. But when I look back on that season now, I'm like, dude, I've never been that close to God in my whole life. And I grew up in the church. Like, I have never felt that close to God. I have never had my faith be like, literally, those movies where like the hero or the heroine is like, hero, whatever it's called. And the guy, like they're dying. They're like on a cliff and they're like hanging by like one fingernail and like that's all they have to like keep them alive. That's what it feels like. It feels like the only thing I can hang my life on is my faith. If I don't have my faith, I'm dead. I don't have anything. And so I'm hanging on to my life with my faith. Like, I have to believe that God can do a miracle. I have to believe that God is with me right now. Like, I have never felt that close to God in my life than in the hardest season I've ever been through. It's weird. It's like when you get out of that, like when he got out of it and we passed all of his surgeries and he was healthy and like finally we made it, right? Like this is what we're praying for. Do you know what happens when God answers your prayers? It's so easy to go back to living a very just mundane life. You're like, oh yeah, God, yeah, he did that. But before I was like, that was all I was praying for. My point is this. Sometimes you don't realize that the hardest moments of your life, the lowest points, that might be the moment where your faith grows the most. And so when you face those walls, when you face the dark nights of the soul, I am begging you, remember this. Remember that in those moments, that's when God grows your faith the most, if you say yes to it. You can choose to grow bitter and run away from God, because that's still your choice. He will never do anything apart from your choice. You can run away, you can forget him, or you can be like, okay, what do you have for me, God? What are you doing? How am I supposed to grow in you? Which leads me to my next point, is that often God uses grief and loss to grow us as his people. Grief and loss, it's a part of life. Nobody ever wants to experience grief and loss. And yet all of us do. It's not just when somebody dies. It's when like a loss of a dream. Like you had a dream or you had a dream relationship. You really loved this person. It didn't work out. There's a lot of grief and loss attached to that. Or a job or this or that or whatever it may be. So many things we can experience grief and loss all throughout our lives. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And when we experience those moments of grief and loss, again, I want you to remember, God can use those moments to grow your faith more than anything else. because he knows us. Do you think your faith grows the most when things are going perfect? Or do you think your faith can grow the most when things are not going very well? I wish it was that your faith will grow greatly when everything's perfect. That would be great, but that's not how it works. Your faith doesn't grow when everything is perfect. Your faith grows when you need him. When something in your life forces you to need God, that's when it grows. And so when you find yourself in that situation, I want you to remember, oh, okay, this is the moment. God, what are you doing? How do you want to grow my faith through this? So let's get into the practicals. That's like the overview, but like practicals. How can we actually grow in God? And this is the point. Don't wait for a dark night or a wall or grief and loss to come. He will grow your faith in those seasons if you say yes to that. But don't wait for that to happen. Don't like invite that into your life. It's going to come anyway. But in the in-between times, right? Like between those hard moments, when life is just kind of like, it's okay. Nothing's bad. Nothing's great, but nothing's bad. Most of us live during those kind of moments. Most of your life is that kind of moment when nothing is that bad. In those moments, how do we grow in God? And it's this, is that you and I each need to find our rhythm. What's our rhythm? How do we seek God in our very busy lives? When you were in high school, you thought, man, my life is so busy, right? But those of you who are in college, look back at high school. Was it really that busy? No. Now, those of you who are in college, you're like, oh my God, my life is so busy. Okay, those of you who are not college, think back. Was college that busy? No. Like, yeah, it was busy, but like, it wasn't hard, you know? Like, everything in life gets progressively busier. When you get out of college, you start working, right? You're like, man, this is not fun, you know? Or like when you get married, have a family, if that's what you choose to do, it gets busier. Life always gets busier. It never gets less busy until you maybe it's time for you to go home. But you know what I mean? Like that's how it is. That's how life is. And so in those moments of busyness, how do we actually grow practically in God? One of those ways is through Sabbath, a hard stop. You know when your computer's like frozen or something like that, or your phone's like frozen, and you have to do a forced shutdown, like a hard shutdown. Like press the power button for a long time and shut down the computer or the phone to restart it. Sometimes we need that kind of hard stop in our lives, whether it's a moment or a day or a week or whatever it may be in your lives that you can do, even if it's like 5 minutes in your lunch break, press the hard stop button. Be like, God, I'm going to hard stop right now from the busyness of my life and all the distractions. And God, I just want to rest in your presence. Because here's the thing. You and I, we are not human doings. We are human beings. Remember that? You're not a human doing. You're a human being. And so, you and I are called to be in God's presence. Not do all these things, but to be. We're called to be with him. And that is the focus of our lives. It should be the focus of our lives. But often it gets pushed to the back burner because we're so busy. And so we have to find a rhythm, a way that we can make him first, be with him like we're made to be. Which leads me to my next point. If we can love God and truly be with him, then we can love others well, like we're called to love. Love God and love others. That's what it's like to be a Christian. Like the Good Samaritan reminded us, like that's what it's like to be a good Christian, is to actually love others practically. So I want you to think about who's that person in your life you just can't get rid of. Okay, like either it's a family member, so you can't get rid of them, okay, or it's a friend or an annoying coworker, or that person in your life that you're like, oh, they drive me crazy. How can you practically love that person? So my aunt, she's also a pastor's wife. She actually grew up as a PK and then became a pastor's wife. When she got married, she was like, I will marry anybody as long as they do not become a pastor, because she was a PK and it was very hard for her. And so she married my uncle, That's my dad's younger brother. And he was just like working, like he was just like a regular old dude. Not old, he was whatever. Um, and a few years into their marriage, God like very clearly called my uncle into ministry to be a pastor. And she was pissed. She was so mad because she felt like God just totally just like played the cards on her. And for 5 years, they had a very difficult marriage because she was just mad at God. But, she worked it through and God was good. And, now they've been in ministry for like 20, 30, 40, I forget now, long time. But there's this one thing that she always said that it resonated with me. And she said, in the world, workplace, school, whatever, if there's someone who drives you crazy that you just hate, okay, you can cut them off, right? You can change jobs. You can not hang out with that person. You can ignore them. You can find ways to cut that person out of your life, right? But in the church, it is very hard to cut people off. We do it, but it's not healthy, okay? And she talks about in the church, if there's someone who's annoying and drives you crazy, it's like hugging a porcupine. That's what she called it. She's like, it's like hugging a porcupine. Like that person that drives you crazy, usually Jesus uses that kind of person to teach you how to love those who are hard to love. It's like hugging a porcupine. And that's always stuck with me because I'm like, dude, that's true. There are always people at church. Y'all have that kind of person too, right? Maybe you're like, oh, I'm great, everything's fine. There's somebody at this church, maybe not here anymore, but there was somebody in the past, at least, at this church that was your porcupine, that you're just like, I just want to drop kick that porcupine out the door. But that's not what we're called to do. We have to embrace that porcupine. So think about, who's your porcupine? Who's that person in church or in your family that you can't just drop kick out of your life? That's the person that God's like, hey, I want you to learn how to love that person. When you love me, I will give you the capacity to love that person. Which leads me to my last point from last week. Remember, for us to actually grow up and out in God, we need to have some kind of structure. The rule of life, the trellis. Remember the trellis, okay, I don't have a picture. The trellis, when you grow tomatoes, you need what's that thing? So it grows up, okay? Or vines, you have to grow them up and out. The point is, if you don't have a structure, a trellis, a rule of life, if you don't have that, you're just going to grow out and then get stepped on and then just die. It's not good. But the only way to grow up and out and be healthy is to have some kind of structure in place in your life so you can actually grow in God. And that's what it means to have a conscious plan, an actual plan. You have to have something. And experiment with what that is. Maybe it's I know for Sam right now, he's really into the Bible plans on the Bible app. Use that. If that works for your life, do those things. If it's running outside and turning on worship music, whatever it is, do that. Whatever works in your life, what brings you joy, use that to know God more somehow. Experiment, but find what works for you in your life, a structure, a routine, something that helps you to remember God throughout your day. Because that's our ultimate why. We have to know what our ultimate why is. Y'all know I love this diagram, the golden circle. But you have to know why. Why do you love God? Why do you want to grow in God? Why is it important for you? You have to know your own why, because that drives everything you do. There's this verse I want to remind us of, Hosea 6:3. It's our main verse for this year for our church. And it's this. Let's go to the actual verse. Oh, that we might know the Lord is the verse. Okay, go to the verse. Oh, that we might know the Lord. Let us press on to know him. Do you see that? Let us press on to know him. He will respond to us as surely as the arrival of dawn or the coming of rains in early spring. As sure as the dawn always comes every single day, so God will come and meet us if we press on to know him. And that's our verse again. Can we show that theme verse? Let us press on to know the Lord. Let us press on to know the Lord. In this last year, I want to ask you, how have you pressed on to know him? How has your relationship with God changed? I'm not asking for lots of growth because you know why? Growth in God is not measured in days or even like a year. It's measured in decades. It takes decades to see your relationship with God grow, but it only grows if you put in that growth every single day. And so, how have you pressed on? I like that. It's not like, let's just come back to God. It's wherever you are. If you've fallen away from him or you're really deep with God right now, let us press on to know him. Let's push in to know him more, no matter where you are on the spectrum, because we can always know God more. There's always more to God. He's like an endless ocean. There's so much to him that we can never fully know. And so, how does what we learned today apply to you? Let's put up our last set of questions with this image. This is the end of our series. And it's asking just really simply this. What's your biggest takeaway from this series? What's the biggest thing you take away? And number 2, what is the one thing that you realize more about yourself from this? And what is the one thing you want to do to grow closer to God through this? Can I have the praise team come up? Can someone also grab, yes, thank you. Okay, so wherever you are in your relationship with God right now, let us press on to know him more. This year is not over yet. We still have a few weeks left. Maybe God isn't done with you. No, I know he's not done with you. Can we all stand? Whether it was through this series or other series throughout this year, which I'll go through at the end of our last Sunday of our year, I just want to remind you, none of us are done. None of us are done. There's so much that we can grow in God. Press on to know him. Let's spend a few moments right now praying before we sing our last song. Ask him, God, what are you doing in my life? Through this and this circumstance, what are you doing in my life? What do you want me to grow in? How am I supposed to know you more through this? Maybe you're thinking of that porcupine in your life, whether it's at church or in your family, that you just drives you crazy. And yet God's like, here, this is what I'm teaching you. Maybe something else, I don't know. But right now, let's just respond to God and say, God, here I am. Help me to press on to know you more. Help me to experience you more. Help me to know my why I do this, why I love you, why I want to know you. Even the good things we do, like worship and prayer and reading the word, if we're not careful, it can become something that we use just to do the right thing, but our hearts are not moved. Our lives are not changed. And it becomes another thing that we just do as lip service. So let's come back to God right now and say, God, here I am. Renew my heart, make me new. Here I am again, down on my knees, surrendering everything to you and saying, God, would you move in my life? Let's pray together right now. Yes, Jesus. this song together. Here I am, down on my knees again, surrendering all. That God would renew that heart in us, the desperate heart to know Him. Let's sing together. Here I am, down on my knees again, surrendering all. Surrendering all, and find me here, Lord, as you draw me near, desperate for you, desperate for you. And I surrender. Drench my soul as much want to know you more. I want to know you